All right. Once again, thank you so much for the opportunity to give a plenary presentation at this amazing conference. This is also my first time attending a SORTEE conference, so this is awesome. Thanks so much to the organizers, and I hope this is going to be inspiring and thought-provoking for all of us, including myself. My name is Israel Borokini, and I'm an assistant professor at Montana State University, Bozeman. I'm originally from Nigeria, did my bachelor's and master's in plant biology, botany, before coming over to the US for my PhD in ecology, conservation, and conservation biology at University of Nevada, Reno. Today, I'm going to be talking about advancing the ecology and evolutionary research in the global south from an African perspective. So I'm going to be bringing my art as a Nigerian, as an African, and also currently being an assistant professor in an American university to be able to bridge those two together. Okay. So first, just to talk a little bit about my research, I integrate ecology and evolutionary biology together through ecological modeling and phylogenetic analysis to understand the drivers and mechanisms of biodiversity from population level to functional trait, taxonomy, community, and ecosystem levels or dimensions of biodiversity, and using that to inform conservation, management, and also to advance science. And I work with plants most of the time. Occasionally, I work with animals when I have willing collaborators, but most of the time I use plants in my research, and I have work spanning across small scale to broad global or continental scale. Okay, so I'm going to start with what we already know, that the latitudinal diversity gradient hypothesis predicts that for most taxonomic groups, biodiversity or species richness is the highest towards lower latitudes, and it reduces as you go towards the poles. And so that makes us to zoom a little bit into Africa. And so what is so unique about African biodiversity? First, the Guinea-Congolian biome, which is the second largest tropical rainforest in the world. And in fact, and so that makes it a very important carbon sink. In fact, some studies have shown us that in recent times, the Amazon basin is no longer a net carbon sink. There's more greenhouse gas emissions going out from the Amazon than it is sequestering from the atmosphere. So, which makes the Guinea-Congolian basin the largest terrestrial carbon sink. The savanna the African savanna is the largest grassland biome in the world and also holds the largest diversity of ungulates as well. I mean, you've seen a lot of pictures, and some of you may have visited the safaris to see all the various mammals there. And with about 2,000 native languages, Africa has the largest linguistic diversity in the world as well. And I must say, sadly, that many of those languages have been lost, and a large number of others are threatened with extinction as well. So this is a really, really sad and a grim story that we have to be considered. We have to be worried about, because it's not just about the biodiversity, but the linguistic diversity that connects the traditional or the indigenous knowledge to that biodiversity also needs to be protected. So since the 1700 to 1800 to early 1800, when Alexander von Humboldt went on his voyage to various parts of Latin America and other parts of the world, to Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, this question have been posed as to why do different regions vary so much in the number and the types of diversity that they hold? And till today, we are still answering that question. We also know that the tropical regions or areas close to the equator not only have the greatest biodiversity, but they also have the most threatened ecosystems. And many of the 36, a vast majority of the 36 global biodiversity hotspots have found in areas close to the equator. But Even in spite of that, there's still a lot of major knowledge gaps for biodiversity in that part of the world. On the graph on the left shows the areas where there is data deficiency in what we know known biodiversity information. As you can see on the y-axis of that graph, that a vast majority, or the greatest bars are found in latitudes that are close to the equator. And if you look on the slide on the right side, it's basically showing the same thing flipped with the axis flipped, whereby you see in the latitudes on the x-axis that these are the areas where we have little information about biodiversity, are those close to the equator as well, despite the fact that we have a lot of information, we have a lot of hypotheses that these are the regions that have the greatest biodiversity. And so how can we conserve biodiversity when our knowledge about it is really limited? And that is a major, major fundamental problem. And again, this slide also shows the same thing, where a lot of sampling events are in Africa and perhaps other parts of the world, tropical regions of the world, are antiquated. On this graph there, you see that all those red dots, those are areas where the sampling event were only one time, a very few one occasion where the sampling was done in those regions, and areas in blue are the places where there have been repeated sampling, and so we have more information about them. Now you can see that for amphibians, for lions, and for birds, there's very little areas. A small portion of the continent have been well surveyed, leaving a vast region needing to be properly surveyed and for better understanding. Um, what is, apart from the fact that these regions have huge biodiversity, what else is unique about biodiversity in the global south, and how has it contributed to ecology and evolution as we know it today? We start with the theory of evolution. With Darwin and Wallace, their work was purely based on the fact that they've gone on global voyages to various parts of the world, especially in tropical Asia, tropical Latin America, and parts of Africa. And their visit and their knowledge and their studies in this region is what inspired the development of the theory of evolution. The same thing, Wilson and MacArthur developing the theory of island biogeography, was based on the studies they did in Asia, their visits to the Asian continent many, many years ago. The same thing with the unified neutral theory of biodiversity and biogeography, was based on Stephen Hubble's work at Barro Colorado Island in Panama. And again, with the theory of coevolution by Daniel Jansen, was based on him study acacia and the flies that co-evolved that have a strong biotic interactions with this plant. And so you see a lot of important ecological theories, evolutionary theories that we are studying today were based on research that were done in the global south. And this is why it is really, really important that we continue to build on this. And this is why this plenary and the organization of this workshop, of this training, of this conference is really, really important. So what is the state of R&D in Africa, research and development in Africa? And this is where it goes really, really south. First, just to give you a little bit of background information, Africa is home to over 1.3 billion people. It's the youngest continent by human population age. Over 60% of the world's arable lands are found there, 30% of natural resources. But unfortunately, Africa contributes only about 2% of the world's R&D. And only about 1.3% of global research spending. And less than 1% of global research patents come from Africa, and there's an average of 198 researchers per million people on the continent. And these are areas where there's a lot of improvement are needed, which are some of the things that I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the presentation. Poor funding is a major problem in Africa. This is where I'm going to be going through what are the challenges, what are the problems, and then moving forward into how we can solve the problem, what are the solutions to these problems. And since the 1979 Monrovia Declaration to the 1980 Lagos Plan of Action, the 2006 Khartoum Endorsement, and the more recent 2015 African Union Science and Technology Innovation Strategy for Africa by 2024, there is a lot of promises made by African leaders to allocate at least 1% of their GDP to research and development. And you can see on the graph, on the bar graph to your right of the slide, that only one country has been able to do that, to commit 1% of their GDP to R&D in Africa, which is Egypt. The rest of the continent is being extremely, awfully slow. And and then you have those two bars there, which is comparing the world average and also the country that contributes the most to of GDP to R&D, which is Israel, which is what is on the first bar on the graph. And so you see, comparing the world and Israel to the rest of the continent in Africa, what is being contributed to R&D in Africa, which is abysmally low and needs to be improved on. This is a major, major problem, and it's a fundamental problem upon which other problems build on for research and development in Africa. And then you might ask yourself the question, because there's so much natural resources, so much money, GDP being generated on the continent, where does African money go? This is a question I myself as an African ask myself all the time. And you can look at here, you see a large, at least one area that stood out to me of where African money go is paying African politicians. You see on the bar, presidents paying themselves a huge chunk of money as annual salaries. For example, the largest one there is Cameroon, with paying the president, only one person being paid over $600,000 a year. Even US president doesn't get paid that much. And then that is just one person. And then oftentimes they also have first ladies who also have official positions who are being paid. And then they have tens of federal ministers who are also paid huge amounts of money. And then hundreds of lawmakers in the National Assembly who also get paid a huge amount of money. When you put all of that together, that is probably about 40 to 50% of the GDP of the country being paid to politicians. And then they have little money left for R&D, for infrastructural development and other things. In fact, and then does it surprise you that countries that pay a huge amount of money to their politicians also have extreme poverty? They are also the highest in terms of extreme poverty on the continent or globally. You can see a strong correlation there, inverse relationship. The higher you pay your politicians, the more the poverty among the people. So here, if you have not noticed already, I speak from the art, and I'm just exposing the problem. So when we talk about how do we move forward with Africa, we need to understand where the problem is and what Africa needs to do for itself and what the rest of the world needs to do for Africa. Africa has its own responsibility as well if Africa needs to move forward in terms of research in ecology and evolution. And let me put a little bit of spotlight, since the highly paid president in the continent is from the Cameroonian president. This is a president who has been in power since 1982. Even before then, he was the prime minister. And at 92 years old, he is the world's oldest ruler. And he's still running. He's been a president for 43 years. He's seeking his 8th term in this year, in this very month. I'm not from Cameroon, and I don't know many people from Cameroon, but this is something that breaks my heart when I see someone being paid over $600,000, excluding allowances, and they have a GDP of $56 billion compared to US that has over $29 trillion of GDP, yet the president in the US gets paid only $400,000 per annum. Compare those two together. And then because he's old, he's not able to do much of administration. And so does it surprise you that that Cameroon ranks 155th among 193 countries in Human Development Index? Does it surprise you that almost 30% of Cameroonians live below poverty level? But it's not just Cameroon. Cameroon is just a perfect example of African leadership and politics and leadership crisis, where so many people make amass wealth for themselves in leadership, leaving nothing left for research and development. So this is a fundamental problem. Because we can come from the global north to come and fix something, but if there's no buy-in from the African leadership, it will not be sustainable. And so this is a really, really important thing. In fact, a couple of months ago, years ago, the president was sick, and then people are speculating maybe he died, and then they had to even made a law that nobody should speak about the president's health because it is a matter of national security. If you are in a bar drinking wine with your friend and you talk about the Cameroonian president being ill, you will be arrested. That is what that law says. And then we talk about democracy. We talk about democracy. So what else? What are the impacts of poor funding for research on the continent? It means there's shortage of resources. Think of you in your office in Global North with Wi-Fi, with internet, with computers, with fast processors. Many African institutions don't have access to those things. And so how will they be able to do research, bioinformatics, or big data analysis when when many people are still using the laptops they purchased 15, 20 years ago? And these are professors, not just early career people, professors who cannot afford to buy state-of-the-art materials, even for themselves, resources for themselves. Basic reagents in laboratory and reagents are lacking, oftentimes because they cannot afford it, or sometimes even when they order it, it takes many, many months before it comes. In fact, I was speaking with a colleague from Latin America because when I was preparing this presentation, I decided to do interviews with some colleagues in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America to try to bring various perspectives together. So some of the things I'm saying, they are not just what I observed, but information I gathered from people I interviewed, talking with them about what are the challenges for doing research in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. And one of my colleagues in Latin America said sometimes even when they order some basic reagents, it takes up to 3 months before it arrives. 90% of research in Africa is self-funded. This is a very, very important point. When I was in Africa, as of 2014, when I left Africa to do my PhD in the US, I had published about 50 papers. I had published about 50 papers. All those papers I published, I did the research by myself. I did the analysis by myself, and I used my money to publish them in to pay the publication fees in journals. My institution I used to work for in Nigeria did not contribute a single penny to fund the research or to pay for the publication fees. And my story is not an isolation. A vast majority of Africans, people who are doing their PhDs, they have to go and take loans or use their family money, family support or personal money to do research. That is how people do research in Africa currently. And so when people get papers coming from Africa and you are the reviewer or the editor and you say, well, this paper has low generalization because they are studying in small areas. Well, they use their money to do the research. They used their own personal money to do the research. So how do you expect them to go to have a large study area? They have to do something within their means. This is a major problem. This is a vast, big problem in Africa. That is why you see a lot of studies coming from Africa have small study areas, have low generalization, because most people use their money to do the research. And so that is something for us to think about when we see publications coming from Africa. I have a lot of colleagues who are early career scientists, professors in African universities. They have to teach 4 to 5 courses per semester, especially foundation courses whereby they have 300, 500 students in the class and they don't have TAs. Unlike us in the US, you teach a big class, any class that is more than 30 students, you must have a graduate teaching assistant helping you with it. Well, many of my colleagues who are in the same level with me as an assistant professor in African universities, they teach 4 to 5 courses per semester and they don't have TAs. How do you expect that person to have time to do research when they spend so much time teaching a lot of classes? And a lot of areas where there's cutting edge research being done in the global north, those opportunities are yet to reach the African continent in areas in evolutionary biology, phylogenetics, and many other new research tools. There's little to limited regional research activity, and I'm going to give some examples of those in coming up. And because of all these funding situation, many African researchers are vulnerable to parachute science, pseudo-international collaborations, and predatory journals. And that has resulted in a lot of brain drain due to unemployment, even for PhD holders. So let me give you a little bit of example. A lot of people in Africa are digitizing their herbarium specimens, their museum specimens, and depositing the data in GBIF. But who is using those data when Africans deposit the data into GBIF? Who is using them? You can see on the graph, a vast majority of the users of those data are from Europe and North America. Look at Africa there. They are the least users of the data being deposited on GBIF, even though they deposit a lot of it. And you see that over many years. It's not just 1 year, over a lot of years. This is a graph that came from GBI Science Review document itself, tracking who is using their data. And you can see Africa is the least user, and also Oceania as well. And then we look at this graph, which shows a lot who is doing research where, and those teal circles shows a lot of researchers in that continent doing research elsewhere, publishing papers of research done in other continents. You see there that Europe is the one that has the biggest bubble of people doing research who are affiliated with European institutions, and they are doing research elsewhere. Compared to China, compared to Mexico, compared to Brazil, where many people are doing research and in their local country, that is, the research they do is mainly focused in their own country. And so we talk a lot about open science, open data, this and that, but there's some issues around it, around colonial or parachute science that we need to be aware of, such that we're not just sitting down in the comfort of our air-conditioned offices and downloading data sets and just doing research with them without doing proper acknowledgement and training for the people who generated the data to start with. And then looking at collaborations, funding is a major driver of collaborations. You see the one bubble there for South African institutions. They only collaborate among themselves and a little bit with other parts of Africa, other parts of the world. And then you see another small bubble for Europe doing some work with Ethiopia, and you see the rest of the world in terms of bubbles of who is doing what. A lot of collaborations going on. Funding is a main driver for institutional collaborations, and that's what you see here. But then it's even worse when you look at international collaborations. You see South Africa doing a lot of collaborations with UK, with the US. Is South Africa doing collaborations with other African countries? Very little. There's very little lines going from South Africa to other countries. There's little lines going from Kenya to Uganda or Zambia to other African countries. Everybody is doing research with the global north. Nobody is doing research among themselves in Africa. The same thing you see, Cameroon, Congo, Togo, Ghana, little research among themselves, but they are doing research with the other parts of the world because that is where the funding is coming from. I have a lot of colleagues in Tanzania and Kenya, and I keep saying there's a lot of political collaborations between the two countries, but there's little research collaborations between the two countries, even though they share a lot of flora and fauna together. You would not see a paper published between Tanzania and Kenya collaborators. You will not see paper published between Nigeria and Cameroon or Nigeria and Benin or Togo. Everybody is doing their own thing. Even though the plants and the animals they work together, they work on has a transboundary distributions. And that is a major problem because of limited funding or limited regional funding and cooperation. And then we're looking at the long-term ecological research stations in Africa, especially globally, especially for coastal and marine ecosystems. You see a lot of marine and coastal long-term ecological research stations out there represented by those bubbles, by those red dots. How many do you see for Africa? Only 4, all of them clustered in South Africa. Even though we keep saying and we keep teaching it that that the latitudinal diversity gradient we need is highest, biodiversity is highest at the equator or towards the equator. But where do you see marine ecosystems being monitored the most? It's in the global north, not in the regions where it is the highest. And then a paper that was recently published a couple of years ago about native versus non-native English speakers. How much of hurdle do they have or do they have to encounter when it comes to reading a paper, writing a paper, going through paper rejections, revisions, or even preparing for a conference presentation? And you see that on this graph, on this image, it is higher for non-native speakers than for native English speakers. And so when you are a reviewer and you pick up a paper coming from the global south, think about these things when you are making your decision, when you are making critical evaluation or assessment of that paper you are reviewing. So how do we move forward from here? I've shown a lot of challenges being faced by Africans and other colleagues in other parts of the world in the global south. So how do we move forward? African has its own role to play, and I'm going to come to that, but I want to start from our colleagues in the global north, including myself. Number one, we need a public and massive awareness on what is called democracy. Many people say, well, we vote for this, we vote for that person. But because in Africa, we used to have a lot of traditional institutions. For many, many millennia and generations, people were governed by kings, by traditional institutions. And so oftentimes people still see their presidents, their prime ministers, their governors as kings, people that you shouldn't question them. You should worship them, almost worship them. And so that is a problem where people are participating in democracy, but they actually don't understand the values and their rights under democracy because they still subconsciously treat those political leaders as traditional institutions or kings that you don't question. So you see somebody who is embezzling public money, but then they are driving on the streets and people are waving at them and they are hailing at them. It's like this person is corrupt, is wasting your money, and yes, you are still welcoming him and you are still beating drums to welcome him home. So there is a need for a massive public awareness on what is democracy and the rights of the people. Funding institutions need to allow grant money to be used to buy equipment. This is a big issue, especially for someone like me who work in the US, and then you want to do research in Africa or maybe Latin America, and you apply for NSF funding, and they say, well, you can use the money this way, you can use that money this way, but you cannot use it to buy equipment. And then you want me to still go to Africa to go and do research, but I cannot buy equipment for my local collaborators there. So some of these funding institution policies actually perpetuate parachute science because we cannot use money to train people, we cannot use money to buy equipment to train them in their local institutions, but we want to do research in the global south. So we need to rethink those policies so as to allow funding institutions, allow the grant money to be used to purchase equipment that will be used by local collaborators in the global south. And I've seen a lot of organizations in Europe, in Africa, in the US, doing training workshops, doing all sorts of training workshops, inviting people to come to their countries to come and do training workshops. It is really important. Number one, it is cost effective, and two, it is even more effective to do the research in the global south. Let's bring back training workshops to the global south. You cannot invite somebody from Africa to come and do a training on laboratory techniques in your well sophisticated laboratory in Europe or in the US, and then you train them in those equipment, but they don't have those equipment in their countries. And so it is really, really important for us to bring back those training to Africa so that you can see the equipment they have and you can improvise with them. And moreover, if you invite people to the US to come and do some training, you can only maybe pay for 20 people to come. But if you bring that workshop to Africa, you can bring 100 people to attend the same workshop for even less amount of money. So it is time for us to bring training workshops back to the global south and not just inviting people to come to Europe to come and do training workshops. We need to ensure, and many of us are doing research in Africa, and many people we know, we only interact with the older global south colleagues. People have been professors for 20 years. Those are the people who are getting collaborations from the global north. And I want to encourage us to start looking for and involve and engage the early career scientists, those people who have the designation lecturer 3, who have the designation assistant professors. They are the ones who need more of this involvement and this collaboration, not the older professors who are close to retirement in Africa. We need to start to rethink the way we engage with collaborators in Africa. I've seen a lot of publications coming from Africa, from the global north, and then you just include one or two African collaborators who are people who are close to retirement or are already retired. We need to start engaging with the early career scientists in Africa and in other parts of the global south. And we need this funding to enhance regional research collaborations. And I mentioned some of these organizations or NGOs or funders because they have done an amazing job in Latin America, providing funding to bring Brazilians, Chileans, Argentinians, and some of these institutions across the continent in South America for regional collaborations. And we need to do the same in Africa. They were able to do that effectively and successfully in Latin America, and we need to do the same in Africa, whereby don't just go from China to Tanzania or Kenya to go and establish an institution and work with Kenyans. Let's do research to bring all the local researchers in that region together to collaborate and do work together. The same thing in West Africa, the same thing in Southern Africa, the same thing in Northern Africa. We need that regional research collaborations, not just working with one country and just pumping money in and out and doing a bubble of work there. And we need to find ways to solve the problem of people getting reagents and equipment, shipping them quickly to the places where they need to go in global south. People having to wait for 3 months, 4 months to get equipment shipped to them, that slows research. That really, really frustrates and slows down research. And we need to really think about this and how to make research move forward quicker in the global south. But at the same time, I also want to shout out and to acknowledge various efforts going on to provide free online courses for universities and that are being offered by universities and professional societies for the global south. I want to acknowledge and appreciate the efforts going on to provide publication waivers for and scientific writing support for African and global south scientists. Now, Africans, what is our own role? What are we supposed to do? Africa has its own role to play. It's not just about global north doing this for Africa, but what Africa needs to do. And all these suggestions goes not just to the African political leaders, but also to leaders of universities and research institutions. We need to promote brain circulation. There are so many African diasporans who want to come back home and contribute to research back home, but they are being shut down by bureaucracy. I know one colleague who wanted to go to, who is from Ethiopia, who wanted to go to Ethiopia and offered to them like, during the summer months, I can come and teach some classes for free, teach some classes and do some training for people. And it was shut down. It was rejected by his own institution that were from his own country. And this is something that we need to think about how we can move things forward in this area. Secondly, we also need to revise civil service rule. I will use myself as an example. I used to work for a government institution in Nigeria as a scientist, and then I decided to go to the abroad for PhD, and they said, well, you have to finish your PhD within 3 years and come back home, otherwise you lose your job. And I said, well, I'm going to the US. There's no way I can finish a PhD in the US within 3 years. They said, well, that is a civil service rule. We cannot change it and this and that. The same thing in Nepal, the same thing in many, many African countries. At the end of the day, I lost my job in Nigeria just because they were not ready to change the civil service rules. And then the same African countries are complaining of brain drain. These are something that can be changed easily by African institutions. We need to learn from the South American initiatives, which include the region to promote transboundary research, regional research, to fund access to high impact factor journals, to fund institutions, universities to be able to have access to publications that are in various journals rather than having to go through paywall. We need to diversify research funding for universities in Africa. Almost every African university depends on their local government for funding. How about the alumni groups? In fact, even in the US, a large, huge of funding that goes to universities in the US come from the alumni groups. Why are African institutions not pursuing their alumni groups, especially the rich people, the successful people who pass through the universities, who can fund research in their alma maters? I personally think it is important for us to reduce the retirement age for many experts in Africa so as to allow many early career people to get jobs. Up to now, many institutions, for you to retire, you have to reach 70 years of age as a professor before you can retire. In some government jobs, it's 65 years. But if we reduce the retirement age, they can retire early, go live their life, or you can start your own local business and open door for more early career scientists who have new methods, who have learned new methods, new tools to get jobs. In fact, countries in Africa that have lower retirement age also have low unemployment rates because there's more jobs for the younger generation while the older generation retire early. And then we also need to invest in high quality education and research through private partnership. Again, goes into diversifying research funding, not just depending on government. But through private partnership as well, we can get a lot of funding to support research in Africa. The list is endless, but this is where I'm going to stop on areas where we need to work on, because I believe it is not just about Global North collaborators. This is a presentation in the right direction. SORTEE has done an amazing job by provoking this conversation, but it's not just about the Global North, but Africa also has its own role, has its own responsibility to make the continent move forward in terms of R&D and R&D outputs. And this is where I'm going to stop, again, by thanking and appreciating the Society for inviting me to give a talk on issues on R&D in Africa and how we can move the continent forward, and generally the global south, for us to be able to advance scientific knowledge and be able to build human capacity for effective biodiversity conservation in Africa and beyond. Thank you so much and I appreciate the opportunity.